Hello, and welcome to Pathways to Healing, the Perfect Step podcast. We are your hosts, Cody Norman
and Logan Fry, paralysis recovery specialist at the Perfect Step, also known as TPS.
We are not doctors and are not prescribing anything, as this podcast is for informational purposes and should not be considered legal advice.
We are, however, sharing knowledge and experience that we have gained from working for years with clients in the paralysis community.
The guests on this podcast will include either experts in their respective fields or individuals sharing their unique experiences with paralysis.
Suggestions and advice that we share may affect each person differently, as not one injury or diagnosis is the exact same.
We are hopeful that the outreach of this podcast will allow us to give help and guidance for individuals suffering from paralysis.
We understand that this spread of knowledge is important and takes an entire community coming together.
Because of this, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who have made this possible.
You're a business owner in the retail, restaurant, hospitality, or petroleum industry. You have ambitious plans for multi-site remodels, refreshing your brand, and integrating the latest technology, but you need a partner you can trust to bring those visions to life. Enter Apex Imaging Services. With a legacy dating back to 1949, we've been at the forefront of innovation and transformation for over 7 decades. From licensed general contracting in 48 states to cutting-edge tech solutions, we've got you covered. Our services include everything from interior and exterior refreshes, open and closed remodels, and technology integrations, to 3D virtual tours, data analytics, and cloud security for Fortune 500 companies. But it's not just about what we do, it's how we do it. We're dedicated to quality, value, and efficiency. We listen to your needs, tailor solutions to your goals, and deliver results on time and on budget. So whether you're planning your next remodel, seeking to enhance your brand, or embracing the digital age, Apex Imaging Services is your partner for success. Visit apeximagingservices.com to learn more. Apex Imaging Services, your vision, our expertise. The Be Perfect Foundation is not just a name, it's a promise. A promise to individuals living with paralysis that they are not alone in their journey. Founded by Hal Hargrave Jr. in 2007, after his own life-altering accident, we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization dedicated to providing direct financial and emotional aid. Inspired by a quote from the movie Friday Night Lights, we believe that being perfect is about doing everything you can, especially for yourself, your family, and your friends. With nearly $10 million raised and a 100% volunteer staff, your support goes directly to those in need. We assist with medical supplies, wheelchairs, home adaptations, and exercise-based therapy programs. Our board of directors receives no salary, ensuring that almost every dollar donated makes a real impact. Visit BePerfectFoundation.org to donate or learn how you can get involved. The Be Perfect Foundation, changing perceptions daily. Welcome to The Perfect Step, a beacon of hope for those living with paralysis. We're not just another recovery program, we're pioneers in exercise-based recovery, transforming lives every day. Our mission is clear: to provide an improved quality of life through intense exercise-based recovery, education, research, and development. We treat conditions such as spinal cord injury, stroke, Parkinson's, and more. What sets us apart? Our clients often experience an improved level of function, sometimes even below their entry level. Imagine the possibilities when exercise is medicine. We're wheelchair-free, focusing on load-bearing activities to enhance function, bone density, muscle mass, sensation, and circulation. And it doesn't stop there. Our clients often reduce their medications and complications. But we're not just a program. We're a community of support. You'll meet peers who understand your journey, along with specialists dedicated to your recovery. Visit theperfectstep.com today and take the first step toward hope, health, and healing. The Perfect Step, where recovery begins.
Welcome back to episode 5 of Pathways to Healing. On this episode, we have guest Jenna Hardy-Surina, a mental health therapist who shares a unique perspective due to the fact that she used to be a specialist at The Perfect Step. She is a wealth of knowledge to the mental health community.
Jenna will cover many different topics, including mental health approaches, psychological responses after injury, different technological advancements in the field, and she will speak about her business, The Medical Therapist. Stay tuned on Jenna's Pathways to Healing.
Welcome, Jenna Hardy, to Pathways of Healing. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So just to go over a little bit of topics we're going to be covering in this episode with Jenna Hardy-Surina, we're going to go over resources for those with spinal cord injuries, evaluations of mental health, relationships with trainers and patients in the SI community, pre- and post-injury, career opportunities, why mental health matters, and more.
All the fun.
A bunch of other topics for sure. Why don't you start, Miss Jenna, by just giving the guests a background of who you are, how you got here, and why you're a valuable resource to the community?
Yeah, so my name is Jenna Hardy-Surina. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am conveniently located in the same parking lot as the Perfect Step. And actually, my original relationship to the Perfect Step was actually through Hal Hargrave Jr. and I growing up together in Claremont. We're both Claremont High School graduates, and I knew about him and I knew about his accident when it occurred. And then through this longer, drawn out story between him finding rehab down in San Diego at the time I was living in San Diego, led me on this journey, long story short, to actually becoming one of the first of the four specialists at the Perfect Step, which was the first Claremont location. So I was a specialist there for just about almost a decade. And then through my time spending, multiple hours every single day with your clients, I started to realize that a huge component of the job, which I'd love to hear from you guys as well, is that you're not just dealing with the physical, but you're dealing with the mental health aspect of people acquiring these injuries. And during that time, I really realized that mental health component was not being addressed. And so, based off of some other factors as well, I decided to go back to school, get my master's degree in clinical psychology, and then exclusively went on to providing mental health for this community.
That is amazing, and I feel like it's a niche community. Are there a lot of mental health therapists who focus especially on those with neurological injuries?
None that I know of. Now, obviously, since I started becoming a therapist, there are now therapists like Zach. Shout out to Zach Colley. Zach Colley went. Zach Colley is a therapist now, but he also is a C5, C6 spinal cord injury. So I know a handful of people now who have spinal cord injuries that become therapists. And so, but I also think too that just because you have a spinal cord injury doesn't mean that you need to now be the spokesperson for people with paralysis. So I know that Zach would probably be really open and excited to work with this community. But I know there's a handful of other therapists who are paralyzed, but they specialize in different things. And I think that's also important to note here, that just because somebody has a spinal cord injury doesn't mean they have to dedicate their life to serving the population, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean they're now the spokesperson, that they still need to really pursue the things that make them passionate. So are there other qualified therapists outside of me who could work with this population? Absolutely. Do they want to, or do they openly advertise like I do? No. And so, yeah, I am my own really unique niche. I do work with other people outside of the paralysis community. I tell people that my specialization is people whose lives have been flipped upside down by a diagnosis, injury, or disability. So I have a lot of people with just medical complications, and why my business's name is called The Medical Therapist is that so many of my clients interface with the medical community. And as you guys know, I'm sure being specialists, that can cause people a lot of problems too, having to fight insurance and fight doctors, and their whole world is just consumed with rehab and medical stuff. So that kind of is a well-rounded way of talking about my niche and, how that looks between me and other therapists, which I don't know anybody else who really has my niche.
Definitely people's lives are being flipped upside down, like you said, immediately. Following an SCI and a diagnosis just overnight, the next morning, someone might wake up and
right.
Our life's completely different than when it was the day before.
Right. Well, you guys know this too. I'm sure you guys could speak to this more than I can too, as being specialists, about the mental health component of people, especially newly injured people coming into the Perfect Step, and what that must be like working with them initially on the table and what's happening for their psyche there.
Oh, you see it all the time, and you try to stay away from it because we do understand mm-hmm. our realm, and that's in the physical side of things, and we're not you. We don't specialize in that, and it is a fine line. We kind of talked about it, about how when you try to create a safe space for somebody for their body, and they understand that, oh, this is somewhere where I can get out of my chair, mm-hmm. I can stand, I can do all these different exercises. It is a safe space. It's also sometimes not a safe space in that essence, because we're not trained in the mental therapy side of things, and we try to avoid it, but it's it's inevitable. People are going to come in here and, they're going to have a bad day. They're going to cry a little bit. They're going to express their emotions. And
Yeah.
the best we could do, I think, is really just try to listen and
Yep.
allow them to do it. I do my best to, I don't like giving advice because, again, that's not our realm.
Yeah.
So we try to avoid that and really just, again, go back to the physical side and talk about, well, if we do this exercise, your mental health might get a little bit better, and I think it'll help you in the long run. So
Right.
try to get back to our sessions at hand.
Yeah.
That's something that we try to educate our clients on too, is, this physical exercise that we see as medicine is something that's going to improve, hopefully, psychological effects of mental
Absolutely.
health disorder, possibly. And, just speaking on that actually in general, would you mind kind of going over a little bit of maybe somebody that you've seen post-diagnosis and what that was like for you in that kind of realm?
As a therapist or as a specialist?
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Whatever you can share. We know you have
Yeah.
a lot of red tape that we don't want to.
Yeah, well, of course, I'm going to protect my client's confidentiality, but let me give a disclaimer here that, I'm not speaking for the community. I'm speaking up for the community. So I want to be very clear that the things that I'm talking about for the community today is based off of the collective that I've had over 10 years now, going on maybe 15, of being face-to-face in really intimate settings with this community. And I've been listening to this community for a really long time. So the things I'm going to share is not going to be from one of my clients' experiences, but as you can imagine, the majority of my clients share a lot of experiences. There's a lot of themes that show up in my office that transcend one client. It usually is all the clients or all of your clients as well. I just wouldn't know because they're not my client. So I won't be talking about any personal clients on here, but the themes I can talk about. As a specialist, I remember so much of the themes kind of going into, we were talking about this earlier before we even started the podcast. When you guys go and you work with people's bodies, and especially in your position where you're having to place your hands on people's bodies in ways that would normally never happen in our day-to-day world, it's so personal and it requires so much trust as a specialist to be honoring of people's bodies, even when you have to touch their hips or you have to, grab their shoulders or grab their torso. It's very, very personal, but I think it immediately establishes a trust between the specialists and the client. And so it just creates an opening up. And I do remember so many times as being a specialist that clients would just maybe feel trusting, which was a testament to the relationship I had with my clients, of course, but then they would just, dump. And then you're in your position, you're like, what do I do? Because this is so important. But all in the same breath, this is so huge and major for them. It almost seems overwhelming. And so I remember being in your guys' shoes and doing my best I could to stay with what I know, and obviously being a listening ear, which is a really great example. But as a therapist, there are a lot of themes that come up with this community. And one that I think it's important to point out, because I've literally been having discussions with multiple clients about this, is the unique phases of grief for people with paralysis. And it's very, very common for people who are newly injured to not show up in my office initially post-injury. I tell people all the time, I most likely won't be seeing people seeking mental health services to their 3 to 5 years post their injury. And I think it has to do with this uniqueness of this grief process that people are thrown into when they suffer a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or paralysis. And a big part of that is that all of a sudden this tragic accident's happened and you wake up and you're in the hospital and, your life's been flipped upside down. It's been changed for forever. And here you have, we're going to speak to the spinal cord injury community. Here you have a spinal cord injury. Most of the time people don't even know or have never even heard of what is a spinal cord injury, right? And so we go to Dr. Google. And it's like, start Googling, am I ever going to walk again? Or blah, blah, blah. Then up pops, pardon my French, but what I would call inspiration porn. So then Google populates, obviously, these high hitting videos. And it's usually somebody who, these inspiration stories where it's like, they got in a car accident and all of a sudden they woke up and look at them, they're walking and skiing down Mount Everest. It's like these insane, which is amazing, but they're these insane comeback stories. And people go, awesome, I can walk again. And now I want to be very clear. I'm not against people seeking rehabbing to the fullest. I think everybody has the right to do that. But what I think it ends up inadvertently doing is that it causes people to completely delay their grief process. So they're in the hospital, like they can't move. Maybe all four limbs. I mean, their parents or loved ones are being taught how to do bowel and bladder program. I mean, your whole world has been flipped upside down. And that can't be addressed for two reasons. One, Dr. Google and the inspiration videos that are maybe a little bit misleading around what actual recovery looks like.
The one in a million stories.
The one in a million stories, but also we're not going to go down this rabbit hole because this could be a 5-hour podcast, but it's the special fingerprint of how your spinal cord injury played out. And no two are alike. And so your recovery story is going to be unique to you and the way your spinal cord injury played out, right? And so this is what we have to educate and teach our clients about. But then also in rehab, I mean, they're like, okay, we sutured you up. We put all the rods and plates in there. We got you, realigned. Time for rehab. You need to learn how to get out of bed. You need to learn how to get dressed. You need to learn how to live your life. So then you go through these months of, intense inpatient and then outpatient rehab. And then they ship you home and they go, okay, you're supposed to live normally now. And there's no usually any talk around, hey, this is kind of hard. You've lost a lot. Maybe you should go seek a therapist. Like nobody's really kind of like delivering that message. And the only time a psych comes into the hospital at rehabs is when somebody's having a psychiatric emergency. So psych isn't even really introduced unless somebody is showing signs of suicidality. So mental health isn't talked at all. So then they go home and they're like, okay, I'm going to rehab and I'm supposed to be acting normal because I'm like fine now because now they got me in my chair and they've sent me home. But it's not fine. And then it gets delayed. And then I would say once again, then there's this kind of, oh crap moment about 2, 3 to 5 years post where all of a sudden, the hearts and glitter and rainbows disappears and they're like, oh wow. And the reality sets in.
It's funny you use the time frame 2, 3, 5 years. Do you think that has anything with the common narrative of the majority of the recovery process? And I think we know this to not be true, but the common narrative is, you're going to get the majority of your recovery back within those 2 to 3 years.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I know that hospitals and Dr. Google have a huge influence on the way people look at their injury. And so, doctors you've heard it a million times, I've heard it a million times where they say the first 6 months, is going to be, is the window of the most you will get back, right? Which obviously the perfect step doesn't promote or subscribe to that type of philosophy. So it sends people on a wild goose chase, which is not wrong. My biggest point here is that it's just identifying the skipping of the grief. And so there is actually no grief when, just like if a loved one died, immediately you feel that grief. I feel uniquely with this community because of the way that rehab operates, you literally skip that part. And it's an injustice in some ways to this community.
Right. The initial rehab is more focused on the physical sense of recovery instead of the mental sense of recovery. And, from your professional opinion, where and when do you recommend that gets started? Obviously, it's not the same for every single person, but like right away, like 6 months after the injury, like what do you recommend?
Well, it depends. People are designed to be resilient and it depends on what type of coping mechanisms that person already had or what type of family dynamic and emotional language. Is grief socially acceptable in your family, right? I come from a background of a family that really prided themselves in being stoic. And I was raised to be Hardy's don't cry, right? And so that with my own grief process, that really enabled me with my grief. That doesn't mean that I wasn't a strong, resilient, well-equipped person, but there were certain, social and cultural and family norms that are also influential in the way that you're going to choose to handle that grief or not. So obviously, if somebody is really feeling like in despair, I don't even know how to absorb this, I don't know how to digest this, a therapist can help you do that. And therapy isn't long-term. My job is to talk myself out of a job. It is meant to be temporary. So I would say as soon as possible, but that's not going to be the right prescription for everybody. So it's as soon as you feel like the load is so heavy that I can barely, I'm not finding pleasure in things that I used to like to do. I can barely get out of bed. I'm having suicidal ideation or thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore. I have so much anxiety that I can't even go out and socialize with my friends. Anything that's limiting you in those ways are really important.
Yeah, that it really is kind of, I think what you talked about, just individualistic for every single person, and it's going to be different. But one of the things you touched on was their family dynamic and how that affects somebody's ability to cope or go through the grief process, or I don't want to use the word come to an acceptance with their new situation, but in a situation, kind of accept their new life for what it is now, not what it was before. How much of an impact do you think the family dynamic has on that component? And for you in your practice, how often is it that when you're seeing somebody, that family dynamic is something that is focused on because it was either really good before or wasn't really good before, and that's affecting how they go through that process now?
Right. 100% of the time. Our environment is a huge influence on our mental health. It's probably, when it comes to anxiety and depression, the causes for anxiety and depression are usually 100% environmental. And so absolutely, this is a multi-layered question. And so I'm going to go kind of in a direction that I feel a little drawn to talk about, which is it's very common for me to get a new client who's 3 to 5 years post-injured. And then, of course, we have to remember that this injury does not just impact the person who was injured. I was listening to your podcast with Adam Fritz, and he was talking about how the whole family goes through the injury, which is so true. And a lot of times, these loved ones went from just being a husband or a wife or a mother or a father. Now they're a caregiver, right? And that's the majority of our clients here. And so it impacts them too. They also have grief. And then what were their stereotypes about disabilities and caregiving before they were thrown into this role? What coping mechanisms did they have before they were thrown into this role? So it becomes very complex. So it's not unusual that I'll see a client and then end up seeing the loved one who's the caregiver and then also having to do family work with them because so much of that caregiver, I call it the caregiver patient dynamic, really puts a huge stress on what the original relationship was, whether it was mother-daughter, husband-wife, that now it's not just the injury that's disrupting the flow, it's disrupt the whole entire life and whole entire package. So it's so important to address all of it. And usually, if possible, the majority of the time, it needs to be addressed with the whole family.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And how would you say that these relationships with their peers and family and maybe loved ones, how would you say that those are affected immediately? And is there a difference in those being affected immediately and it's 5 years later? That difference between a diagnosis or an injury, and everyone's different. I know it's a pretty broad question. But
yeah. Well, I think immediately families want to fix it, right? And whoever these people are that end up having to assume the caregiver role full-time, if not part-time, want to fix it. And so much of our society is we avoid mental health, right? So a lot of what we do as fixing people is to do something physically for them. And so a lot of my caregivers go beyond and above to try to make their loved one feel accepted, or to get back out, or just recover and just get over it, and all of this stuff. And it, it causes a lot of stress, because sometimes the client is not ready to do that in that process. So it can get really messy. And one of the big things that I find too, I think it's important to bring up is that also, especially if we have a parent who becomes the caregiver of their adult child, we start to revert back to childhood. So it's very, very common for me to hear my clients say, hey, I feel like they're treating me like a little kid. And well, that's all they know as a parent. Like, when they were little, I used to have to help with their bowel and bladder program and all of that stuff. And so the parents revert back to, oh, this is my child. They're fragile. They're delicate. I need to protect them. And then the client kind of gets rebellious and almost becomes a rebellious teen again. And it's like, no, just give me some space. And there's this kind of tug of war that happens between the two, and finding the balance between how can you be a caregiver and a patient, and two consenting adults, and a mother and son, or mother and daughter, or father and son, father and daughter, in ways that don't cause you to start treating your child like they are a child again. They are grown adults at the end of the day. So these are a lot of things that I talk about in therapy.
And they're all very important. I think one of the things that we find pretty common is caregivers or caretakers who didn't necessarily sign up for that job or career. They go through or experience burnout. One of the things that I saw at the Abilities Expo when I went a couple of years back was there is a man, and I forget his name, but he actually runs therapy group sessions, especially for caregivers, not generally the ones who sign up for it as a career path, but who got placed into that position to help them kind of avoid burnout. And I love hearing you kind of give your input in how you try to do that at a more particular level, but by addressing the mental health, because I think a lot of the burnout comes from it is mentally draining. So if you can address that and allow them to have a healthier mental relationship with that other individual, they're going to be in a better spot to avoid that burnout component.
Yeah, well, Logan was asking earlier, what am I seeing 3 to 5 years down the line versus initially, in burnout in the caregivers is what I'm seeing. And it's causing major issues. Because a burnout caregiver is a dangerous caregiver, because that's when we start to lean into what would be considered my mandates, which is they become neglectful, or they become abusive, and they don't mean to be. They just either lack resources, they lack support themselves, like once again, who's supporting the caregiver. And so it becomes very complex really quickly.
I'm not sure if you can even answer this question, but from your professional perspective, would you recommend a mother, father, husband, wife to try to do everything they can to avoid and go outsource for a caregiver? Or do you think that that relationship is possible to be beneficial if you address all the correct things?
I think in a perfect world, there would be a designated caregiver 24/7, but we do not live in that world. And the majority of families are blindsided by this and lack the resources to financially afford that. They also have government agencies. IHSS is one of them, in which they have to apply to become a caregiver. And then IHSS comes into the home and they determine how disabled they believe the person is. And then they assign a certain amount of hours that that caregiver can get paid for every week to do the care. But you guys, caregiving is one of the most beautiful and important jobs on this planet, because to give yourself to care for somebody who can't do it themselves is such an honor. But we treat caregivers like crap, and we do not honor them. They are the lowest paid healthcare workers in the country. And so IHSS basically reimburse them pennies. And so, it's not something that these families can live off of. And so sometimes IHSS will also allow a caregiver to come in, but that's only for a certain amount of hours. There's a lot of bureaucracy. And so everybody's caregiving scenario looks really different. Some families can afford to do the person, but also too, they're paying pennies for these caregivers. And then you don't really have to be qualified to be a caregiver. So there's people who are just essentially hired off the streets to provide the caregiving, and then they come into people's homes, and people struggle to find caregivers who are well educated and who can provide quality care. So then a lot of times too, the caregiver outside of the family members ends up being the mysterious third party in the mental health conflict for my clients and their family, because they also become part of the family dynamic. But they need them, but they are not high quality professionals all the time, because they do not get paid. We don't pay caregivers well enough. The best thing that we could do for our society and population is to pay caregivers well, because at some point in all of our lives, we will end up depending upon a caregiver.
Yeah. How proficient do you feel like those programs, like for caregivers, to train them and to help them to be appropriate caregivers, in the sense of making sure that their clients are taken care of, or making sure that they're following the right protocols with their clients or loved ones? Like, how do you feel like that can improve? Possibly?
Well, there is no programs. Really, truly, anybody off the street can become a caregiver through IHSS. Right. And then there's obviously different levels of care you can be providing. And then anybody who actually has the quality training is most likely somebody who's been through nursing school, but they're not going to go get a caregiving job, because they could go work as a low level nurse and get paid better at a hospital with 401k and benefits. And so there is no, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to speak for these agencies that hire caregivers, but from what I know, the majority of these caregivers kind of just have fallen into this role because of a friend, or they themselves are in difficult positions, and this is what they could do with the type of education that they have. And so it creates a really complex, fun dynamic in therapy.
Oh, I'm sure. I can't imagine. I really can't. You're amazing, and I'm so grateful you're here, and you're a great resource for us. And when we do see it or run into those situations, I love that we can say, oh, well, you know what you can do? You can go across the street and you can see Jenna, because that's not our area of expertise. One question I have for you, and it's a very broad question, is what does it mean to have good mental health?
Well, I would probably, let me tell you how the mental health field looks at mental health, and maybe that would help. Because I think that's actually each person's unique definition of what good mental health looks like. And I actually don't set that definition. And usually when I'm starting off with a client, I ask what's called the miracle question, which is basically, if I was going to wave my therapist wand and I have solved all your problems, and you wake up tomorrow and therapy has worked, what would your life look like? And then in that question, the client ends up dictating not only their goals for therapy, but what a quality of life looks like to them, which is going to be different for everybody. But in the psychological field, I tell my clients all the time, people are getting, especially with TikTok and all these Instagram feeds, people are getting too stuck on diagnoses. And although diagnoses are really powerful, a lot of people who feel misunderstood feel validated through receiving a diagnosis that makes them understand that they're not unusual, or they're not, there's not something wrong with them, that there's actually a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis, to explain the bizarreness that they've been feeling for some time. So I remember a professor said to me, he said, there's nothing wrong with somebody who has schizophrenia. There's nothing wrong with somebody who has bipolarism. The only time in which mental health intervenes, or when we should intervene, is when whatever the mental health thing is ends up impacting more than one area of their life functioning wise. So for example, they're not able to get out of bed, do their dishes, or bathe. They're not able to show up for school, and they're not completing their schoolwork. They've lost their job, right? Well, then of course, there's always going to be something wrong with certain types of bipolarism and schizophrenia, because the nature of the diagnosis itself causes so much impairment. But he was just pointing out the fact that it's not wrong for people to be neurologically different, and it's not wrong for people to have these different battles. We care about function in our world, and insurance cares about function. So when people are impaired and are losing function in more than one domain of their life, that's when we deem it to be a problem. And that's when we bring in the resources to treat it. So I want to demystify that just because you have a diagnosis of ADHD or depression or anxiety or bipolarism or whatever, it does not make you automatically a dysfunctional human being. There's a lot of people who have never gone to therapy that have somehow functioned well with high-grade anxiety. And you probably could think of a couple people in your own head that you know who does that. So that's how I would define mental health, is that people are generally content, but are also able to function in all the assets of their life.
So is it almost, and this is going to be a broad reference, but is it almost like when they stop being a contributing member to society, that they can't contribute anymore, that's when we deem a mental health issue to become an issue rather than just a diagnosis?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great way to explain it. And a contributing human being to themselves. Right. So yes, we want them to be functioning in society, because what's the point?
It's a goal.
Right. But we also want them to be internally functioning in their internal world. And we want people to feel good at the end of the day. We want people to triumph and have the confidence to move through challenges and not be completely derailed by them. So yes, absolutely. That's a definition too.
What advice would you give somebody that maybe they're on the brink of receiving help psychologically or mentally? Maybe someone's on the brink of wanting to make that next step for themselves, but they haven't quite necessarily done that step yet, or maybe been actionable about that. What would you say to that person to maybe help with getting to that process?
Yeah, well, this is a hard one too, in the sense of that, it's so deeply personal. And in my world, I work with teenagers too, and I have parents who will drag their teenager in by their ears, and they're like, they need therapy, right? And the teenager doesn't want to come to therapy. And so I have to remind parents or people that people have to be ready to receive therapy. They have to be in the mindset that they want something to change. I can't force somebody to feel differently. It's not my job. My job is to help people and to guide them to find their own healing. And so I would say to them, just give a therapist a phone call and do a free consultation and ask the questions and let them know what you're nervous about, because probably the therapist could debunk maybe a few myths that you have that are holding you back, or they can help you kind of problem solve or brainstorm what are the barriers to allowing you to get to mental health. There are plenty of people where it's socially unacceptable in their family to receive mental health services. So to do so would basically isolate them from their family. So there's a lot at risk for people to start therapy. It's not just something that you can just walk into for a lot of people. So to talk to a therapist, every therapist for the most part offers a free consultation, and you can get all your questions answered. And then by the end of that, people should have a better idea if they're ready for therapy or not.
I think a lot of people are going to appreciate that information, because I don't think it's general knowledge by any means. I didn't know that most therapists give a free consultation. So That's amazing. And I think that's great for people. You talk a lot about mental health, and it's your job to understand mental health. My question for you is, in dealing with the area of mental health, and especially in neurological injuries, specifically spinal cord, that is what a lot of people would consider a pretty sad field. You hear stories of people's lives getting turned upside down in a moment of seconds. How do you combat that sadness and maintain such a positive mental health? You're somebody who's very energetic, happy, you're always smiling. How do you compensate for that?
Yeah, well, I have really good boundaries as a therapist, and we're taught that in school to have really good boundaries. So I don't take my clients home with me. So as a professional, that's something I've had to learn to do. And actually, that training started being a perfect step specialist. That I remember my first year, I used to go home and cry about some of my clients because their stories were just so, just like heart-wrenching. Some of the things that our clients are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I'd love to hear your guys' reflection about this too.
The same thing. It's a sad field, and there's no way about getting around that, I don't think, and I don't think it's going to change.
Yeah, it is really sad, but also we have the advantage viewpoint that somebody who's newly injured doesn't, which is we know clients who have been wonderful path pavers and role models for what life can look like down the road, and that there's actually a lot of hope and a lot of recovery and still a lot of life to live. And so I think we get the advantage, or at least for me, I feel that when I have a client come in, and they're some of my favorite clients, even when I was a specialist, my favorite clients to work with were the brand new ones, because they were just such fresh little babies to this world that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is such a big world. Just buckle up, because you're going to be exposed to a whole new side of life that you didn't even know existed. And essentially, I'm talking about ableism versus disability. But also, I come from the perspective of understanding what ableism is, which is this idea that if you don't look like me or function like me or talk like me or walk like me, then your life is basically lesser than mine. And our whole society is built in ableism. And so the first question I ask my clients in session when we're first starting to get to know each other is, before you became disabled, what was your belief system about people living with disabilities? Like when you saw somebody in a wheelchair, what did you think? And a lot of times it's not good. It's, oh, I feel really sad for them. I feel really bad for them. And so they carry these ableist views into their injury. And then it ends up sabotaging essentially their mental health with their injury. And so a part of my positivity about this community, even with all the crazy stuff, the caregiving, the lack of, people who don't have resources, is that I see a world that can be big and full, even with physical disabilities. And I really, really believe in that. I really believe that people can live big, full lives, even with physical limitations. So I think that's what keeps me so positive all the time.
I love that. That is just great. And I don't mean to make it sound like this field is all, tears and sadness.
No,
it's
but
amazing. Right. And you get to see amazing achievements and triumphs and people doing things that they haven't done since their accident or injury, and, things that they were told they'll never be able to do.
Right.
It is amazing in that sense, but like we did talk about it, it can be sad when, you just have to sit down and listen to somebody's story and think like, wow, that happened to you.
Right.
And there's nothing you can do but have a form of sympathy. I like to say that we really can't have empathy. I can't put myself in your shoes and try to think about how your life has changed, because it's changed in every single way, but we can have sympathy for them. So I think that's a big delineation.
Well, what you're
to
speaking to too is that humans are humans. We all are going to go through tragedy. We all are going to go through hard. Nobody makes it out of here, unscathed, so to speak. So we have to remember too that it's not just this population. And also how I see this injuries is that, and what I hear in my office is that actually a lot of people are already kind of going through stuff that they weren't forced to work on because they were still just keeping their head above water. And this injury came in and lit it on fire. So a lot of times, actually, yes, we talk about the injury in my office, but we talk about how the injury exposed what was already there. Mm-hmm. And so that also allows me to have a somewhat peaceful relationship with the injury, in the sense of it's not actually always the injury that's causing so much of the pain after. Don't get me wrong, it causes a whole lot of, everybody knows it causes a whole lot of additional issues that not a lot of people need to put on their plate, right? But a lot of my conversations revolve around what was going on before their injury, and then the injury comes in and it basically exposes them raw, or they can't avoid those things in their life anymore. And now the injury's just exacerbated it. So it's also just humans being humans, and we all share some sort of trouble, even if it's not a physical disability.
Right. Kind of speak on also continuing on the optimistic side of that, because you just brought up the optimistic point of view of that too, is that there's so many different people where after a diagnosis or after their injury, where they find that quality of life and they start to focus on the quality of life measures instead of just the physicality of that after the injury. Right.
Yep. Absolutely. I also think too, it's almost like a near death. It is for some people, it's a near death experience. And it gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now, but how many clients I have who hate, don't get me wrong, hate the injury and wish they could take it back, right? But are also grateful for it because it gives them that near-death experience, life perspective. And for a lot of my clients, they've gotten sober because of this injury. They've formed deeper and more powerful relationships because of this injury. They've stopped BSing, just kind of walking through life, just kind of internally suffering, just going through the motions, and now they're living very intentionally. This injury gives a lot of problems, but it also offers opportunity for a lot of gifts. And I know maybe you guys don't always get to hear that side of it, but I often hear that side of it in my office. And that's also fun for people to discover, is the opportunities that this injury provides them.
It's actually life-changing when you hear somebody say, this injury diagnosis saved me.
Yes.
This saved me, and this
Yes.
made me to be a better
Yes.
person than I was pre-injury diagnosis. And that's like mind-blowing for me. And it's very humbling. It's like, wow, you have such a great mindset, after having such a life-changing and altering event happen to you.
Well, I think it speaks to the power of what a near-death experience, and I'll call it spiritually, can gift you. And so it is kind of part of this greater existential wonderfulness about being a human is that in a lot of tragedy, there is always usually a gift. And it's just up to you to see it and receive it. And so, yeah, it's kind of a interesting little field we work in, isn't it?
It's a very interesting field.
I know you spoke about it a little bit already, but I kind of want to, if you can, dive maybe a little bit deeper into, you don't have to talk about any maybe specific stories that you've had, but what had influenced you to go from the physicality of being a paralysis recovery specialist into now wanting to work into this field of mental health?
Yeah. Well, I can speak about one client because he was my client at the Perfect Step. And so there was no confidentiality barriers there. And also an award's named after him. But David Steckline was one of my clients while I was a specialist at the Perfect Step. And he was unique in the sense of he was diagnosed with a rare cancer, which then the treatment for that cancer rarely gave him a spinal cord injury. So he was battling an uncurable cancer that gave him a spinal cord injury and was living in the chair that way. And so when I met him, he was a very influential pastor in our community, obviously a wonderful husband, father, and grandfather, and just great sense of humor for living such a kind of not hope-filled future. Which he would argue against, obviously, as a man of faith. He would say there was a lot of hope for him in the future. But him and I had a special relationship because at the time I was granted permission by the Hargrave family to go do rehab with him in his house. And so, especially towards the end of his life when the cancer treatment was getting pretty intense and he kind of couldn't get out of the bed, I just go in and help him move his body around. And we had so many wonderful life talks. That was just really powerful for me. And that relationship was very healing and powerful for me. But during that time, I felt like one of my strengths as a specialist was the emotional side of the injury. I felt like I'm a very empathetic person. I can read people across the room really easily. I'm very sensitive to people and their feelings around me. And so I really loved that part of the specialist job of being that listening ear, and almost like I kind of looked at myself as a cheerleader for people when they were struggling. And so that's what really him uniquely, a few of my other clients, and then just that gift I felt like I had pushed me into doing that.
Very cool. That transition from leaving the community and going back to school and, just leaving a career path and again, going back to school. What was the hardest part of leaving? No, still, I understand you knew that you were going to be coming back and you were going to be doing something else, but what was the hardest part of leaving for you?
The relationships, the family dynamic that's created here at the Perfect Step. You can't, look, I've been to traditional physical therapy. They're dictated by insurance. And so there's structure and they're trying to get you the heck out of there as fast as possible, right? And so there really is no time to form relationships. And then uniquely, when I was a specialist, see, you guys have all these fancy aids and all these things now. I'm gonna sound like an elder specialist, but back in my day, when I was a specialist, when we first started, we didn't even have aids. So we used to have to stop and help transfer each other's clients on and off equipment when we were just like the mom and pops of our first thing. But it's family. And then we didn't have as many specialists as you guys do now. And so I would spend the full 2 hours with all of my clients. I spent more time with them than I did my own family. So you can't help but form deep, important relationships at the perfect step. And so I was going to miss that.
A sense of community.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Which I've heard many stories from current clients that we still have, how much they miss you and how lovely you were to them. So I hope that you know that too.
Oh, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and you being such a selfless person, maybe you can speak a little bit about, we're kind of curious on where you see yourself in the next 5 to 10 years. You know, is there something that you see yourself doing specifically that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, I look to continue. So I'm in private practice. I look to continue to grow that. I just opened up my practice again to children, and I'm hoping to specialize in children with disabilities. I love the medical disability community. I feel like I have something to offer them and their caregivers. And so I plan to stay here, but I'm hoping to broaden my scope to children. So I hope to have a little bit higher of a child clientele in my office. But I don't know. I told Hal Hargrave Jr. I'm probably just going to, die in that office over there. Like, it's just, I don't see, I plan to be here for a long time. So I guess the 3 to 5 years to grow this, and then just continue to listen to community and offer additional services that the community wants and needs.
Do you think that there's the potential of you trying to fix something that you were talking about earlier about it not being something that's immediate? Do you ever see yourself trying to find a way to create a partnership with a hospital or a particular outpatient rehab service that's not ours that would allow you to kind of fix something that you were talking about?
Yeah. So funny you ask that. I actually not too long ago did reach out to a prominent rehabilitation hospital in our general area. And I did talk about because so many of our clients come from these hospitals. And so we know about the rehab process, and they have beautiful rehab processes. But I also know the deficit that was coming from it not being brought up. So I had actually talked to some directors at these certain hospitals, and if they could, they would. But their hospitals' whole worlds are dictated by insurance. And also bureaucracy around the type of level of hospital that they are, whether they're level 1, level 2, level 3, that also gives them a certain amount of funding. I mean, it's a whole business world that we can't even imagine to understand for those directors and presidents of those hospitals and CEOs, because it's very complicated. So I'm saying this nicely, but they weren't in a position to do that. And one of the other kind of excuses that was brought up is that when you're initially injured, you are literally having PT, OT, and doctors rotating. You're being so bombarded by all the communities that it would just be too overwhelming to introduce mental health. I disagree with that. But I understand what their point is that we don't need to add additional layer into this.
Is there a particular resource that you're aware of that, whether it's a documentary or a video or a podcast or something along those lines, where if somebody is in that hospital situation and they can't find a way to get to mental health, is there a resource that you would have seen that you would suggest that would be beneficial for them to allow them to focus on their mental health while they're focusing on their recovery?
I think anything that they can get their hands on that's coming from real life people and not Dr. Google. So this podcast absolutely should be a resource for people who are newly injured and not sitting in a hospital. The Triumph Foundation, the Be Perfect Foundations, these wonderful foundations in our community, and the model of the Triumph Foundation, which is they're that early intervention, right? So they are kind of replacing what I'm talking about by coming in, visiting people who are newly injured and giving them a whole backpack full of resources and pamphlets. So those are really great. There's so many great documentaries. I can't think of the names right now. I wish I would have known. I would have written them on a list, but I know Netflix had one about, do you remember what the name of that was?
I don't, but we'll put them in the comments below
Okay.
for the viewers.
Yeah, I know Netflix came out with one which was really inspiring and really great, but I think it's really important for people to hear the real and raw, and that's what this podcast provides versus, a lot of these documentaries are highlighting the glorified, and they're wonderful, inspiring stories, but it doesn't show the nitty gritty of the day to day. And I think it's really important for people to know that they're not alone in the gritty day to day, that their life or their trajectory to rehab isn't less than because their world isn't looking like that documentary.
Definitely. And that's part of our mission statement for sure with this podcast is getting fitness or medical professionals like yourself, but also getting clientels and people that have gone through those stories and being able to share those stories and share the nitty gritty and share that, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but other than that, there's a lot of dark, deep things that you're going to be going through with this diagnosis or injury, but you're not alone.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Ms. Jenna, you're a family therapist and mental health therapist, like we talked about, but that's not all you are, right? Mm-hmm. Me and Logan met you in a completely different facet. You wanna talk about that a little bit?
Well, I don't know if I look at my identity as a yoga instructor, but it is something that I do on the side. But yes, so I know you guys originally from being your yoga instructor for your college baseball team, which was at the time a fun little thing for me to do in the early morning for extra cash while I was not only part-time still working at the Perfect Step, but I was also going back to school full-time to become a therapist. So it was fun doing that with you guys in the morning.
Yeah, fun. 6 a.m.
You were hustling.
I know, you guys hated my guts. Yeah.
But we loved you after because we felt
we did.
amazing after.
And you definitely changed my perspective of yoga, and now I'm somebody who I do it pretty consistently, and it definitely wouldn't have been that case if you hadn't got intervened.
Yeah, well, you guys were my best students. So, yeah, and I love seeing that you guys are still doing yoga. How many of your teammates from your baseball team would you say are still doing yoga?
Maybe 2.
Yeah. AKA you 2.
One hand, maybe.
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, you did yoga for us, a baseball team, but you are trying to create another alternative pathway where you can provide a service for other individuals. Can you speak on that a little?
Yeah, so this all actually started when I was still a specialist for the Perfect Step. And Hal Hargrave Jr. got approached by Lululemon. And each Lululemon store likes to do some sort of philanthropic work where every year they donate something to a nonprofit. Usually it's in the form of yoga donations or classes or whatever. But he got approached and they're like, hey, we want to donate to the Be Perfect Foundation and support this community, but we're not sure how we do that. And he's like, well, you could get one of my specialists certified in yoga, pay for them to get certified in yoga, and then we will adapt yoga classes for this community, because obviously you can't just get a yoga teacher off the street to do this, right? And so Hal knew that I liked and did yoga. I was the only specialist who liked and did yoga at the time. And so I went through this intense 6 months, I think it was 4 months process every weekend, going through this yoga certification. So I became certified in yoga. And then started our ultimate long-term goal was for me to provide adaptive yoga classes. But then, shortly into that, a couple years later, the pandemic, all of life happened. So now here we are. The wonderful Perfect Step has expanded, and you guys now have this group exercise studio. And so now Hal and I have kind of pressed the play button again on that. So probably as soon as this podcast airs, I imagine, or shortly after, I will be offering adaptive yoga classes for people in chairs, which I'm really excited about. And a lot of those classes will be structured and based off of the philosophy and training I got as a Perfect Step specialist, and that viewpoint of how do you use normal able-bodied equipment and make it adaptable for people in chairs. And so I'm really excited about that, but also offer yoga classes to caregivers and other people who could use the supportive yoga.
Awesome. Where can somebody go to find more resources or information on this?
So nothing is officially up yet, but I know that Hal will be, and Juana and the TPS people will be sending out a little flyer in the latest newsletter to the current TPS clients. But of course, give the Perfect Step a call. Juana is going to be kind of the main facilitator of that information. So if somebody who is not a Perfect Step client or is one wants to know information, they can call Juana or contact Hal directly.
Beautiful. Exciting.
Yeah.
That's
Very
awesome.
exciting.
Yeah, as somebody who, me and him could both speak on it, do yoga consistently, I think it's a great opportunity for people to be able to go work on themselves,
Yeah.
not only in the physical component, but I think for me, yoga is a really good mental relaxation tool. You know, you get into the deep breathing and you're focusing on the breath, and if you can take that time of a 20-40 minute yoga and get
Right.
1 minute where you can let your mind go thoughtless,
Right.
it changes your perspective of the day, and it changes your ability to decompress.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Well, I hope to have one or both of you be assistants in my
sign us
class at some point and help people with the different adaptive mobility devices I'll be bringing in.
Sign us
We'd
up.
love to.
Love to.
That'll be fun.
One of the things that's been going on recently in our world is a ton of technological advancements, right? You're seeing AI get introduced, you're seeing all these different things. If you were to look at your field of mental health, have there been in the past, let's say 10 years since you started, any technological advancements? And if not, what do you foresee could potentially happen that would help make your job easier, more efficient, in essence, just a or an advancement that would help your field?
It absolutely, I think it's touched every aspect of our worlds. And so absolutely in the psychotherapy field, technology has been huge. I actually think the pusher for that was COVID. A lot of therapists were very old school and very resilient to doing even just telehealth. Telehealth was a very rare thing to do in my field before COVID. Now post-COVID, there's therapists who only see clients via telehealth and operate completely through that platform. There's also these tech, but the downside is that there's been these tech giants like BetterHelp and I forget a couple of the other names who have entered into the field trying to take over the new popularity of mental health after COVID. And they've been trying to use their tech perspective on how to mainstream mental health. And I am concerned about it in the sense of that AI cannot replace the human factor. I don't care how great AI is. And it's really hard for me to explain unless you've sat in a therapy session with a therapist. But there is so much subconsciously or consciously or just the transference between, we call it transference, meaning that like I've had a client before that will say to me, "You remind me of my daughter." Well, she doesn't like her daughter, and that's not a good thing, right? But even in the transference of just who I am and how I present in the room, therapeutically, it brings up stuff. And so I go, "Tell me more about that." And now all of a sudden we're having this whole conversation just on the fact of who I am as a human sitting in the chair to this person, right? And so these companies are trying to mainstream it from a tech, and they're genius in the way that they're doing it. But I think they're producing, this is my opinion, I think they're producing not well-rounded or well-quality results. I'm not saying that there aren't people who are absolutely benefiting from what BetterHelp or these other tech platforms have provided them. They're great for access for people, but I'm concerned when we start to place the human factor with AI or tech perspectives of what psychotherapy is supposed to look like. So that's a concern I have. But I think on the research side of things, AI is going to be powerful in helping us diagnose quicker and more efficiently. I think it's going to help highlight the nuances in some of these really rare diagnoses so people can pick up on it faster. So people aren't in the throes of visiting 50 doctors before finally they get labeled with a diagnosis. So there's good and bad, but when it comes to trying to infiltrate into the therapy space, I get really nervous about it.
Sounds like a an objective way of going about the therapy? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds more of like an objective, factual, research-based, evidence-based type of way of going over that type of therapy as opposed to being the subjectiveness.
Right. Yeah. Because there is so subjectiveness in the therapy process, but also I use my humanness in therapy. And so that's why sometimes it's nice to get away from these programmed or systematic ways of implementing therapy, because it takes away the human aspect of therapy. And so I have to use my humanness in sessions to help people recognize their own humanness and then heal and move through that. And so, yeah, I also, BetterHelp was also being accused of, selling people's data. I mean, this is how they're getting their funding to these third-party advertising marketing people. They were getting in big trouble for that. And if I was caught doing something like that, it'd be exposing clients' confidentiality and I'd be in big trouble. So these tech giants also have all this power and money that they're able to get away with things that I would never be able to get away with. So just little things like that make me a little nervous when we hand over the mental health power to these big tech companies.
I think that's a great perspective that not a lot of people can have just because of your situation and your wealth of knowledge. Speaking on your obvious wealth of knowledge, can you tell us something that you didn't learn in either schooling or your own personal life that about the spinal cord injury community that you learned later on from working with them, and it was kind of like, I wonder why nobody taught me that, or I wonder why nobody told me that? Just something that you kind of had to learn from doing?
That's a really good question. Well, I'm trying to think about my two different schools, right? So I had the physical schooling, but obviously in my bachelor's degree, I was never taught about spinal cord injuries. And that was all, my whole experience was through the Perfect Step, which they gave me essentially everything that I know. As a mental health clinician, I think I can just speak to, and this is really kind of just general to the larger human population, is that I think when you go into therapy school, you're thinking that you're going to come out as a therapist with all the answers to people's problems. And I learned very quickly in school that I will have none of the answers to people's problems. And that type of thing, learning how to sit with that type of anxiety, especially with clients who are really high risk and in a lot of pain, to know that ultimately it's fully in their control, with my assistance and guidance, of course, if they're going to get out of this. So I had to learn that's what I didn't know going into therapist school. I thought I was just going to come out with all the answers and just be able to like roll things off of my tongue and just say these genius things, but that's not the case at all. And so, learning how to sit with the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen for my clients and that it could potentially get worse before it gets better, which a lot of the times it does. I hope that answered the question.
It did very well.
Sounds difficult, but I mean, I'm sure you are somebody that gives a lot of very useful advice. And speaking of useful advice, maybe you can give somebody that just dealt with a diagnosis or somebody that just had a life-changing spinal cord injury. And what is one simple tip that you would give that person today?
Mm-hmm.
Besides reaching out and asking for help with mental advice,
yes.
or mental
Right.
health.
I'm going to say that time is your friend with this injury, and there isn't a race, and that especially in the first 2 years, the best thing you can do, if you can afford to do it, is just to give yourself time and not try to be anywhere other than just working out your BAL program and routine, your rehab, and learning how to just readjust to life day by day and not pressuring yourself to be over it or to get through it. A lot of people put time on grief. A lot of people put time like 6 months later, you're still grieving. And it's like, yeah, for a lot of people, they'll grieve the rest of their lives. And a lot of people, and I identify myself as a griever as well. I'm 15 going on 16 years post my initial grief. And I see myself doing that for the rest of my life. And so I want to tell people that you don't need to be over it. That maybe this is something you will never be over, but something that you will eventually push through. But it takes time to do that. So just be patient with yourself and give yourself time. You don't need to be anywhere. That this injury will always, in some ways, maybe be devastating to you, but at certain times and as time plays out, just like grief, it will get less, and maybe at some point you'll make peace with it. And so you need to give yourself time. 2 years is not enough time to be over it.
It's a quality piece of advice.
Very good piece of advice. Our last question for you, Miss Jenna,
Yeah.
is around TPS. We're focusing on how people are reinventing themselves. Can you give us an example of somebody, or in your experience, how you were able to reinvent yourself?
Mm-hmm. Reinventing themselves. Well, I think the first step to reinvent yourself is to know what your truth is. And like we talked about earlier with people saying that this injury saved them, what they're really speaking to is that this injury forced them to live in their truth, whatever that is. And so you have to be honest with yourself. Am I really happy? Was what I was doing before really making me happy? And actually, a lot of ways, this injury gives people permission to do something different and to start all over again. And that's daunting, but it's also, to some people, a gift because they've been moving through life operating the way that they've told that they should be. And so you have to know what your truth is first. And so when you really know yourself, your truth, and you can accept yourself for yourself, well, then for me, this, the sky's the limit. Anything's possible. So, I feel like maybe at the beginning of my career choices, I wasn't in tune with my truth. I picked, exercise physiology as my initial major because I was an athlete and that's what athletes do. And it's cool to be around athletes, and anything that's not athletic is not admirable of, a career path. And so I was doing the stereotypical athlete move of trying to become a physical therapist and maybe work with athletes. But really, all along, if you look at my truth through my whole life, even going back into my childhood, I was really a therapist at heart. And so luckily working through with this community that allowed me to really lean into that and realize that for myself. And actually, this was probably the career path that I should have been on the whole time. So.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna, for sharing all your advice, your knowledge, your wisdom. We really appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Yeah,
If
thanks for
somebody
having
wanted
me.
to reach out to you, Miss Jenna, and find you and your services, how would they do that?
Yeah, so you can go to themedicaltherapist.com, and on there you can book a free consultation call with me. My phone number's on there, and you can also be able to contact me through email there. But themedicaltherapist.com is the best way to get a hold of me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks
We
for
appreciate
having
it.
me, you guys. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of Pathways to Healing, the Perfect Step podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did.
If you found today's episode to be valuable, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, and feel free to leave a review by clicking the link in the description below.
If you have any suggestions, feedback, or topics you'd like for us to cover in upcoming episodes, you can go to our website under the tab Pathways to Healing and fill out the form.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another engaging conversation giving insight into the paralysis community.
Until then, keep inspiring, stay resilient, and roll on.
These are your hosts, Cody Norman
and Logan Fry,
signing off.